Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Library of Congress National Book Festival and to our session, The Power of Laughter, with Nuar Alsadir, author of Animal Joy, a book of laughter and resuscitation. My name is Steven Leyva. I'm a professor at the University of Baltimore, and I'm also someone who was born in New Orleans. I like to think that as someone from New Orleans, we know a little bit about joy and spontaneity. And also as someone who dearly likes to laugh, to quote Jane Austen, I was really excited to talk with Nuar about her book. I was not prepared for how much I would learn, though, about the body and the mind, about the scripts we must let go of, and how important laughter is for moving inward. Let me tell you a little bit about Nuar Alsadir. Nuar Alsadir, a poet and psychoanalyst, is the author of Fourth Person Singular, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Poetry and the Forward Prize for the Best Collection. She lives in New York City. Alsadir's debut in prose, Animal Joy, a book of laughter and resuscitation, explores laughter, poetry, personal experience, in pursuit of being more present and connected to one's true self. Nuar, I'm so excited I get to talk to you about all of these things about laughter. And I thought we'd start by just talking about a little bit about what laughter does to us. How does it shape us? How does it reshape us? What are the things that laughter can do to the body and the mind?
Before I answer that question, I want to say I'm so happy to be in conversation with you. Thank you for being here with me, and thank you to the Library of Congress and the National Book Festival for inviting me. I'm thrilled. I suppose in order to understand the way I'm thinking about laughter, the first thing to explain would be that scientists divide laughter into two main categories. The first one is called Duchenne laughter, and it's named after an 18th century neurophysiologist who studied expressions and the facial cognates of that. And basically Duchenne laughter is the full-bodied, spontaneous outburst when you lose it, when your body takes over and you have no idea even why you're laughing a lot of the time, but you can't stop. Sometimes tears run down your face, your stomach starts cramping, you make sounds that you've never heard yourself make before. You all know what I'm talking about. That kind of laughter is surprisingly rare. If I ask you right now, I'll give you a few seconds to think back to the last time you laughed that way, where you couldn't stop, not at a joke, not in a rational way, but when you really lost it. Can you remember the last time? Most of us, I see some yeses and some nos, most of us have experienced that, but not nearly as frequently as we experience the other category of laughter, which is non-Duchenne. Non-Duchenne laughter is laughter that is metacommunicative. It communicates something outside of speech. So, for example, you might laugh to let someone know you're happy to see them, it's a friendly interaction, it's safe. If you notice that they're nervous, sometimes your own laughter can calm them down and let them know it's okay, you've got this, just look at my eyes, we're gonna be okay. That kind of laughter is constant. In most interactions, we use non-Duchenne laughter to signal something about the relationship at hand. There's some kinds of laughter, I think, that are in between. For example, you can laugh at a joke and you can laugh really hard at a joke. You know why you're laughing and the laughter is full-bodied. It's still not the same as Duchenne laughter. Duchenne laughter is truly spontaneous and most often irrational. Freud said that that kind of laughter is an escape from the unconscious, which I'm not answering your question. I feel that
But I was fascinated.
There are a few important things to understand what I'm doing with laughter that I need to explain just so we're all caught up. So the first is the distinction between those two kinds of laughter, Duchenne and non-Duchenne. So Duchenne is the full-bodied outburst. In fact, the British call it corpsing. And the reason why they call it corpsing is, it comes from theater, is because the actor who's asked to play the corpse on stage often will break into a hysterical fit of laughter. And it is, you would have to analyze why that actor broke into laughter, but it is also really common for people to have spontaneous fits of laughter at funerals. Freud actually writes about that. It's the least likely place for a person to want to laugh, but it's so common. And you would have to analyze why a specific person laughs in that situation. Oftentimes it can be an escape from the unconscious, a kind of objection or a refusal to play the dead body or to be associated with the dead body, or sometimes at a funeral can just be not knowing how to respond in face of mortality, because it's so difficult. We all know that we're going to die. We all know everyone we know is going to die, but we know it in a place that we don't really turn to, or it's on a shelf that's so high we don't take the thought down very often and look at it. And the reason why there are professional mourners, I don't know if you've all heard of professional mourners, they've been around for centuries. They're people who are hired to laugh at funerals in order to curate the direction of the laughter because of laughter's tendency to get out of hand. All sorts of emotions come up, and sometimes they can be very uncomfortable. So I've been interested in Duchenne laughter. In my book, I'm primarily focused on Duchenne laughter and what it means and what it can express. When I talk about funerals, I'm talking about the almost uncomfortable, difficult ways it can be expressed, but it also is such a source of joy and an expression of joy and being embodied and being alive and spontaneous, and that kind of laughter is actually good for us. It releases endorphins, the feel-good hormones. We feel our blood flowing more quickly, our heart beats more quickly, so blood gets carried to the tissues. Now I'm really far from your question, though.
It made me think, though, about the ways in which, and you mentioned this in the book, we use that idiom, I died laughing, and thinking about corpsing, and it reimagines and reframes that for me. Even like on the internet, on Twitter, we're just constantly saying, I'm dead, I'm dead, to say that I'm, overly, experiencing that kind of laughter. And it makes me think about how we're just expressing that release, that need for the unconscious to kind of like erupt into the real. So yeah, I think you are getting close to what I'm thinking about what it does, because it's done something to me, even just learning and reading about it from your book. You already talked about some of the different kinds of laughter that you explore in Animal Joy. And early in the book, you have a particular experience of going to clown school for 2 weeks. I think some of you are maybe thinking, I would never do that. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what going and attending and thinking about clowning did for your understanding of what laughter does.
Yeah, I know it sounds like a joke. A psychoanalyst walks into clown school. And it was surprising to find myself there. The reason I went is because as part of my research, I wanted to go out into the world and go to places where people laugh. Storytelling, improv, stand-up comedy. I wanted to see when the audience laughed. I was observing, of course I was listening to whoever was on stage, but I was also listening to the people around me. And what I saw surprised me, which is most people laughed not because something was funny, but because it was honest, because it resonated. Some of the things that people laughed at, if it weren't framed in a comedic, setting could have been the text of a therapy session. And I was so surprised to see that, and I was talking about it with someone who said, oh, well, you know, what you should really check out is clown, because when a clown goes on stage, they want to make the audience laugh, but the way they make the audience laugh is by being honest. And the audience doesn't laugh because something is funny. In fact, clowns are very rarely funny in a joke-telling way. They get at what is human, what is true in all of us. And when we see that honesty expressed and someone who is comfortable with their interior and able to express it and be vulnerable, we recognize it with laughter. And when I got to clown school, it was not very fun, especially at first. I was the only non-actor. It was really awkward, really uncomfortable. We had to get up on stage and do all sorts of things that if I asked you to do right now, you would refuse because it's so weird. But what I realized was all of the layers of socialization that we have that make it really difficult if we want to on the spot to be ourselves. So to get on stage, for someone to ask you, one of the things we had to do was sing songs. So we'd be given a theme, we would be in groups, we would make up a song and a dance for the chorus, and then we'd each have to improvise and do a solo. And for example, things you love. You'd have to just get up there and say what you loved. And the person who was most memorable in that song series was a woman who got on stage and she started talking about how much she loved to eat chicken feet and how she loved the feeling of rolling the bones around with her tongue and trying to separate them. And when we saw the pleasure she recalled in describing the process, we felt an authentic moment. It was an authentic communication, and so we recognized that we had our own version of it, even if we hadn't eaten chicken feet or would be, repulsed by the actual act of eating chicken feet. And so when we laughed, what we were recognizing was her emotion and her authentic feeling. And that was really the biggest takeaway from clown school, is that if you want to reach other people, you don't do it by trying to give them what you think they'll want. You do it by feeling an authentic feeling yourself. And when the audience sees you feeling something for real, their mirror neurons fire. When our mirror neurons fire, for example, if you see someone cry and your mirror neurons fire, you can feel the crying feeling inside yourself as though it's your own. Sometimes you may even cry. The fascinating thing about mirror neurons is that the same mirror neurons fire whether you're the one who's experiencing the emotion, the thing that makes the person cry, or whether you're witnessing it in someone else. And so it gives us a way of expanding our subject position. We can literally feel someone else's feeling inside ourselves as though it's our own. So it's empathic. It's a way of being able to experience emotions that we may not be brought to by our own lived life. And art does that.
And poetry.
Poetry.
Right? We were talking a little bit before about ways in which those ideas of authenticity that are brought out by the clown can be carried into your own writing, carried into thinking about how poetry is made and transferred to an audience. Because all the stuff you're describing, I'm like, man, that's what I feel when I read a poem that is just fire, right? Yeah. I feel like something has been brought inside of me that I'm sharing, and yeah, there's nothing like it. Like, it's hard to pin it down.
I sometimes think that when I was in clown school, the instructor would call something that moves you, that makes the audience recognize that feeling of being moved with laughter, he would call it poetry. And at first that kind of irritated me as a poet because, everyone's a poet.
Yeah, right.
And I was a little bit territorial because I was there with actors who were actors and I wasn't an actor. So I was like, well, this is something I have. So you can't just own it and take it away. But then after a while, I really recognized that it is the same in poetry. And I came to consider something poetry if it moves me. And maybe that is the litmus test of what is poetry, if it makes you feel moved. And something can also walk like a poem, talk like a poem, but not move you. And then it may be a poem, but is it poetic? Maybe the true poetic communication is one that makes you feel the feeling in your body as though it were your own.
Yeah, your body has to react, right?
Yeah,
That's
it
why
has
we say,
to be.
when we hear a good poem, right?
Or a good song.
Yeah.
You see a sculpture. Sometimes you gasp. You can look at a painting and you get chills.
Yeah, my dad, he used to be working at his computer by himself all the time, and he notoriously did not like to be frightened, right? And of course, his children would always sneak up behind him and frighten him. But his response was always to go like this. So of course we flew back. We tried to frighten him, he frightened us, and then we all laughed, right? Like everyone, we were trying to scare each other and we ended up just falling into laughter, but it felt very real. Like it felt something beyond what we intended had come. And I don't know, something about that lingers and it feels analogous to the way that poetry is sometimes working.
Well, we're most likely to laugh when we feel safe. I mean, experience Duchenne laughter with old friends, with family members, with people we trust. And part of it is because you lose all composure. Sometimes people even wet themselves when they laugh that hard. And so it's always wise to be around people you feel comfortable with if you're going to go there. But it's also connected to another really central concept in my book, which comes from a psychoanalyst called Winnicott. He had this idea of the true self. The true self isn't an identity. It's a wellspring of deep emotion. It's our core that is in us when we're born. And he described it through a scenario with an infant and a mother. And the infant's expression of the true self is in spontaneous gestures. And if the infant has, and of course it's any caregiver, but he said mother, we're in different times now. I'll just say the mother because he did, but I recognize that it doesn't have to be a mother. So if the mother is able to accept the infant's spontaneous gestures and enforce them, the infant will receive the message that it's okay to express yourself. But if the mother instead corrects the spontaneous gestures, for example, if the baby says ma, and the mother says no, mama, mama, then if the baby says mama and the mother smiles or affirms the baby, then the baby will learn to give the mother what she wants in order to get love. And that's the birth of the false self. We all have false selves. We need it. We need a false self in order to go out into the world. You can't wear your heart on your sleeve. You can't just spontaneously express yourself at all times. But sometimes we can get so good at giving people what they want from us that our false selves can become like armor. And we can lose contact with the true self and the wellspring of our core, authentic, unconscious energies. And so if you want to access Duchenne laughter, those spontaneous outbursts, one of the things that is helpful is if you have an open channel to your true self. If you're able to access your interior and that wellspring of emotion.
Yeah, that way in which, making laughter make us move inward was one of the things I just kept feeling like was revelatory to me. Like I tend to think about laughter as this outward expression, not something that can help me understand my interiority in a particular way.
You're with the right crowd.
Yeah, I hope. There are moments in the book where you talk so much about your own family and about your daughters, and being a parent myself, there were parts of the book where I was like totally into all the philosophy and all the intellectual exploration, and then you would tell a story about your daughters, and I would just be dying laughing, and I just could recognize that moment. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about why it was so important to include a kind of consistent anecdote that was kind of close to the earth, something that was just practical about your everyday life.
Well, I really wanted the book to be accessible to anyone at all levels, and I also wanted to make accessible to everyone psychoanalytic ideas, philosophy, poetry, poetic theory, and I wanted to talk about it in a way that would be digestible, because so often so many intellectual ideas are shrouded with layers of like specific speech and jargon of that discipline. So I tried to get beneath all of that and deliver the core message, and I tried to relate it to where I'd seen it in the world, and my girls are always there. So it was really easy to reach to them for anecdotes. And also, I feel like anyone who has children knows that they keep you real. I mean, even I think about how they would always say, they still say, if I'm getting dressed, for example, if I'm going somewhere, they'll look at me looking in the mirror and they'll say, your mirror face. And it's true, we all have a mirror face. When we look in the mirror, we adopt our mirror face and we look at ourselves, and it's as though we're not ourselves looking at ourselves, but we're channeling some other person who we're looking through their eyes to look at ourselves. And it is this self-alienating moment where we almost exit ourselves to see how other people are going to see us when we walk away from the mirror and we go out into the world. And I didn't want to have mirror face in the book. I wanted to be myself looking out of my eyes, and I wanted to hold myself accountable for that kind of, it's really a sort of hiding, it's a way of hiding yourself behind familiarity or jargon or intellect.
Yeah, it's funny you're talking about mirror face, and just when we were getting ready to come down, my spouse was like, why do you always lift your chin when you're in the mirror? Why are you always like looking like this? And I didn't realize I was doing that.
It's your mirror face.
Oh, absolutely. I know now. I have a name for it, and we'll have to admit that to my spouse. There's a particular anecdote in the book in which your daughters are asking you, "Are you angry with me? Are you angry with me? It seems like you're angry with me." And your response is, "No, I'm not. I'm just thinking." And your daughter responds, "Oh, I realize your thinking face and your angry face are the same face." And I was like, that's excellent kid wisdom. Like right there. And it's such I found so much joy in being able to connect those things between, hearing about Kant, hearing about Nietzsche, hearing about philosophers and psychoanalysts, and then seeing how practical it could be, just with the same ideas coming from the mouth of your own children. That just endeared me, to the book. So it was a delight.
That's also one of the ways in which I try to raise the stakes a little bit in the book, to talk about the dangers of not being connected or being severed from our true self, because we all have intuition, and our intuition in many ways is our highest form of intelligence. We can know whether we're safe, we can know what the communication means even when the words are saying something different, and we're trained so often to override our intuition or the signals we're receiving at the animal level. I have 2 dogs, and if I watch my dogs, They know if someone's walking down the street and something is off, even if it's a human being, they can feel it and they react. And I often will force them to keep walking because I know what it's like to be polite when you walk down the street, but sometimes being polite or being safe or hiding is a way of not really saying that there's something that might be off or dangerous. I mean, it's one of the lessons I always give my girls. I say, if something feels off, it is. And, we often, even in politics or if we're being told something by authority, we can feel like it doesn't feel right or real or false. And do we just accept it? Do we put our self forward? Do we override our intuition? What happens if we access our true self in that moment and tune into ourselves and ask, well, what's my read of this situation?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I realize, I've probably had that experience when I tried to explain to friends my interactions with the police, and saying, doesn't seem like that was a big deal. And I was like, it didn't feel like a small thing when I was in the car like this, white knuckling it. But it's such a, I don't know, we were talking a little bit earlier too about authenticity and about how authenticity can often feel like such an uncomplicated value, like who doesn't want to be real, right? And yet we can't always perform perfect authenticity depending on the context.
Yeah.
And sometimes people will use authenticity to police your behavior. You're not fill in the blank. You're not black enough, you're not queer enough, you're not Arab enough. The way in which authenticity is not an uncomplicated value. That's one of the things I really appreciated about the book. I mean, the term you use is savage complexity. That's something I'll probably carry with me forever, that idea that we need a kind of savage complexity to deal with how much authenticity sort of is difficult to wrestle with.
Yeah, we need to acknowledge that we're complex and we're not stagnant, that we keep evolving and changing. And I do think that in the same way there's Duchenne laughter and non-Duchenne laughter, there's almost an equivalent to empathy. I think there's Duchenne empathy, where you feel it in your body and you really feel for someone. And there's non-Duchenne empathy, which is intellectual, where you understand that someone is suffering and you can still know it's wrong and you can think about it ethically, but you may not feel in your body that feeling that you feel when you're feeling the other person's feeling inside yourself as though it's your own. And that's why art can be so effective in expanding our subject position and helping us to feel Duchenne empathy towards other people, because we're more likely through art to feel moved. And through arguments sometimes we can understand it, but it doesn't necessarily reach us in our deepest recesses of our being.
Mm-hmm. The book really takes me to some places I didn't expect that we were going to go. And one of the areas you cover is talking about the ways in which laughter and the erotic have some simpatico, right? There are ways in which laughter and pain can be very two sides of the same coin. What are some ways in which you were navigating those waters in which it seemed like the Venn diagram of things that seemed desperate were just really synthesizing or overlapping?
Well, there's, it does really hurt when you laugh. Like when Duchenne laughter, if you're in a fit of laughter, it can hurt, but it's also so pleasurable. And there's a French term, jouissance. It's used for orgasm, but it's also used, we translate it sometimes as bliss or enjoyment, but there's no English word for it. And it is that kind of pleasure that rubs against pain. And it's it's a little bit also like, now I'm getting intellectual though, I'm sorry, I just said that I wasn't going to go here, but because I see that we're going to move to Q&A in a second, I'll just throw this out there for anyone who's interested. Freud also has this book called Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where he basically argues that our tendency as organisms is towards pleasure, towards not only good feeling, but also what he calls the nirvana principle, to feel at peace. It's like lying in a hammock on a beautiful day where nothing is intruding upon you from the external world in any way, you're undisturbed. But he also in that same book introduces the death drive. Mm-hmm. And he struggles a little bit with how to put the pleasure principle and the death drive together, and he doesn't fully resolve it, and people have spent, century now plus trying to figure out how it works. But maybe I should stop there.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like a good place. So we'd like to invite any questions from the audience that you have for Nuar or about Animal Joy, her lovely book. You can come to the mics here and here. And just before we begin the Q&A, I want to say that Nuar will be signing books from 4 to 5 o'clock after the session if you're interested in that. So what questions do we have?
Hi, thank you so much. Just very much enjoyed it. I've never connected with anything more in my life because I've grown up with just surrounded by Duchenne laughter with my mother. And so I was just curious if there's any sort of connection between Duchenne laughter and maybe like Duchenne weeping, because I don't know if
I didn't hear you.
Like a connection between like Duchenne laughter and maybe, I wouldn't know what you call it, but like Duchenne weeping. Like if you've ever been laughing so hard uncontrollably and then you just start to cry.
When I was in clown school, the clown instructor said the wah-wah is attached to the ha-ha. There's actually a control center in the brain that controls both, so they are definitely connected neurologically. But also, the other thing my clown instructor would say is crying is only laughing harder. And when a performer was on stage in clown school and they would laugh, when they would cry, we would laugh so hard because it was so connected, or sometimes when they would laugh, we would cry, and the two are interchangeable in many ways. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I haven't yet read your book. I'm looking forward, but I'm really interested in the title, and if you can tell us about the title and whether you write about animals in it.
It comes from, I'm quoting Chekhov. In one of his notebooks, he wrote, "The so-called pure joy of childhood is animal joy." And it is connected to animals in a number of ways throughout the book. I would say the most fundamental way is I really call for people to be embodied and to reconnect with embodied knowledge, or Audre Lorde calls it non-rational knowledge, because we have so many different kinds of reason, but we foreground logic. And sometimes by foregrounding logic and making that the main way that we understand people's situations, we're really only flying with one of our engines. And if you take in all of the information and all of the different kinds of communications that you're receiving from the universe and from others, you really have a fuller sense of what's happening. Mm-hmm. And you can feel more deeply, too. Mm-hmm. You're welcome.
Excellent.
Hi, thank you for being here. So in talking about the true self, let's say if, for whatever reason, you're estranged from the true self, like, how would you, as a psychoanalyst, what advice would you give to either reconnect for it or connect for it with the first time?
Well, I think most people are in some way estranged from their true self, because most of the social rewards we receive are for following the rules and for following the path that's set for success. So if you're doing well in social terms, you often have a strong false self. And so sometimes the better you're doing in your life, the harder it is to be connected with your interior. I also find in psychoanalysis, when I work with people, that I see people whose lives are lined up beautifully, and you know, they're extra. You have a choice. You can line up your internal chips and let the external chips fall where they may, or you can line up your external chips and let the internal chips fall where they may. Most people sacrifice their interior to line up the external world the way they want to see it, but you want both, obviously, but to try and think about what it would be like to line yourself up internally. When in psychoanalysis, one way we think of it is to come to know your desire. It's hard sometimes to separate what you think you want, or what you're told you want, or what you're taught to want, or marketed to want, from what you really want. And that's a question that might be a good place to begin. But also just anything that gets you in touch with your unconscious, paying attention to your dreams, any kind of parapraxis, like slips of the tongue.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, so someone earlier asked a question about Duchenne weeping, and I had a question about Duchenne embarrassment, if such a thing kind of exists, because throughout your talk, I think there's a lot of similarities between Duchenne laughter and Duchenne embarrassment. I mean, at least like for me, when I get embarrassed, I'll involuntarily cringe or like say, oh my God, out loud, or just like do something, have like a physical response, which I didn't think about. And then I think throughout your talk, you were talking about the false self, and I think embarrassment is kind of a result of that. Like when your false self overrides your true self, you feel embarrassment at a moment of vulnerability. And then, sorry, this is a long question.
Go for it.
And then I think, though, there is a moment where like some people are able to laugh at their embarrassment, so it kind of comes full circle in a way. So I was curious if there's any research out there, or if you know anything about that relationship between embarrassment and laughter.
Well, I'm wondering what you're calling embarrassment. You can tell me whether this resonates. I might call it shame, because, people look at it differently. I would say simply shame involves being embarrassed before the eyes of someone else. And even if that person isn't around, it can be imagining them see you, or imagining them having seen you, or what it would look like if they saw you. Whereas embarrassment is sometimes a little bit more between you and yourself. And shame would be directly connected with the false self, because it would involve how someone else was seeing you, and the false self involves whether they're approving or affirming or punishing, and whether you're following the rules, not following the rules. And we have, since our origins, all sorts of ways of shaming people for being their primal selves, for being close to their animal. Things that come out of our body are embarrassing. I talk about this in the book, but there's this question. Okay, so all day we go through our lives, we swallow the saliva in our own mouths constantly. I mean, you're probably doing it right now as I speak. But then if someone asked you to spit into a glass and drink it, it would be repulsive. Why is it repulsive? That once it's left our body, it's disgusting, but inside of our body, we understand that it's part of what we need to live, and we can even feel appreciative for it, or it's bad to have a low level of saliva. Most things that come out of our body are humiliating, not naturally. To children, they're not humiliating. To animals, they're not humiliating. What do we do? Why is it important for us to feel shame around what comes out of us? And how does it travel from the body to the primal, true self, unconscious, whatever you want to call it, our interior? And I think that there's a complicated connection between them. And so I think that shame is probably Duchenne when it's connected to spontaneity or bodily stuff that is primal, and then it's wronged, or it's deemed wrong by ourselves or others in some way.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure.
I promised myself I would stay on topic, but as everyone's been talking, I'm a massage therapist, and everybody keeps talking about what they physically do when they're feeling something. And I can just say from like the ground level, a lot of people, myself included, have no idea what their body does when they're feeling a certain way. Like I'll have to tell people to stop talking about work because you're talking up here, you know. So I just keep thinking about how hard it is that we're so disconnected from our bodies in all kinds of ways. And so, good, I've brought myself back to my topic, because the thing I wanted to ask was more about, since you said it at the very beginning about how like we even have like the skull emoji for when we're laughing so hard. And then there was something else in there that made me think of social media, because I don't think, mirror face, because I think a lot of us are like looking at our mirror faces all the time, or I'm not the first person to make an argument that we're losing our authenticity on social media. But anyway, I'm just wondering if what you think about how that gets in the way, like the fact that we're not really literally laughing out loud, we're typing LOL. So we get we lose all that physicality of laughing. Anyway, and I think about that a lot because I'm a big laugher, and I just had to apologize to somebody at another thing because I just laughed at something somebody said that I was the only one who laughed, and then I was like, I'm sorry, but then I don't want to, and look what I just did. I'm like, made myself
make yourself small. Yeah.
Sorry. So anyway, that's my. I don't know. Was there a question?
To respond to two parts of that. So the second part, I have this in my book. My daughter, when she was 3, I overheard her call someone beautiful. And I asked, what does beautiful mean? And she said, beautiful means most self. Wow. And I was like, whoa. 10 years later, she's 13, and I asked her, would you rather be beautiful or photogenic? And she said, And then she thought about it for a long time, and she said, well, I think I'd rather be beautiful, but I think you get a lot more out of being photogenic.
Oh, ugh.
And to the first part where you're talking about massage therapy and where people hold their emotions, in psychoanalysis, if someone's issues are pre-Oedipal, which is come from the pre-verbal period when they don't have speech, part of what I have to do is tune into their body and the unconscious communications, and unconscious communications travel through the body. So part of being trained to become an analyst is also being trained to become attuned to the communications that aren't only delivered in words, but to add those other layers.
You're like a massage therapist and a clown and a psychoanalyst.
Well, I try.
So, we'd love to maybe get all the questions that we could, but we're right at time. Thank you all so much for being a lovely audience and listening to us talk about laughter.
Thank you.
I just want to thank again the Library of Congress and the NEA for sponsoring, and we look forward to seeing you at a book signing at 4 o'clock. Thank you, be well, keep yourselves safe, and have some Duchenne laughter if you can.
Thank you.